Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen and fanatics across the country. Well, however much of it we're reaching anyway. So good to have you on this Leap Day Spectacular. My name is Paul Boyé, and you are joining us for another wonderful, rousing, lovely edition of a little project we're calling TGPTV. This day only happens once every 4 years. I hope you've got something great planned, and something great also qualifies as listening to the Phillies on the radio, not on the TV, naturally. That's why you're watching us. But as always, I am joined by my partner in crime, Mr. Alex Carr, my co-contributor at TGP. Alex, hello. Greet the nation.
Hello, Mr. Paul. Hello, nation. It is I, a newly minted 23-year-old boy. Just got to celebrate a nice birthday, and I'm glad to be here.
Well, and that spectacular belated happy birthday wishes, of course,
Thank you,
to
sir.
you and yours. I hope you had a wonderful one, and I hope 23 is even better than 22. I know it was for me, but
We'll see.
That was ancient history at this point. Anyway, we've got things to talk about today. There are things happening in spring training land down in Clearwater, and they are all good. Well, mostly good, anyway.
It's a
We've
change.
It's unusual to be now a little more than a week in, right? And think, okay, what are we missing? I mean, there are a couple of things that aren't going perfectly right, and we'll talk about those. But for the most part, we're going to talk about whose stock is up, and the stock ups far outweigh the stock downs, which is always good to see. We're also going to talk about some of our favorite leaps in keeping with the day. We're going to talk about a couple of guys who were flashes in the pan, or who emerged out of nowhere, or who had one really great season, or in one case, one really great month, and then were either never heard from again or just didn't live up to that kind of potential. And of course, we're also going to talk about Andrew McCutchen, who we learned yesterday, thanks to the Athletics' Matt Gelb and a couple of other reporters, that Joe Girardi is announcing that Kutch will not be ready for opening day, which is a bit of a blow. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into things. But first of all, Alex, we're going to start talking about the camp so far. And through a week and a half, you can't really draw a lot of conclusions. You can't definitively say who's won some of these spots. We don't know who the fifth starter is yet. We don't know who the last person on the bench is going to be. All that stuff is still a little bit undecided. But we have been given some pretty encouraging signs from some of these guys, and we want to take stock of whose name is trending up, and unfortunately a couple who are looking like they're moving toward the outskirts of things. So I'll kick it over to you for a second to get us started here. Who's made a really good impression for you so far at the outset of camp?
I mean, it's no secret that the young kids have all really been, producing, especially in these early few days. I mean, you've got guys like Luke Williams, who's 5 for 10 on the spring, so a guy that nobody was really thrilled that they spent a third-round pick on, but now is turning into this super utility, upward power trending, super fast, he's kicking butt. He's started with a 500 average. You got like Nick Maton, who's showing some good defense, some quick hands, some really nice plate discipline. Guys like that who are really coming out and making really big debuts. Mickey Moniak, who half his fan base wants to murder and ship parts of it. They want him gone. But the first overall guy is really, he's starting to produce. I mean, he's made some really nice defensive plays. He had that stand-up triple the other day that was just, he scorched it. I mean, he's really coming along, and he had a career year last year in Reading, and a lot of people don't want to acknowledge it, but maybe he wasn't such a bad pick after all.
Well, and that brings up an interesting point, right? Because we've been used to Moniak as a prospect for so many years now.
Right.
He was a first overall pick already 3 years ago. This is a guy who is still younger than a lot of players are by the time they make their debut, who are prospects for a far shorter time, who are in a different situation, of course. Moniak was a high school draftee and signed. There are some guys who spend 3 years in college, 4 years in college, maybe JUCO. They come out after a couple of years of something a little bit higher than high school ball, and they can move through the system quicker. Moniak, yes, it's not as if he's had some hidden great time in pro ball. He hasn't really killed it, but he has steadily improved. You look at his numbers year over year in all these pro leagues as he's been promoted and advanced through the levels, he's kept up the numbers or at least gotten a little bit better in some areas. And I think it's fair to still say that he's, got some expectation to him. He's certainly not a closed case.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have to remember, a lot of people were complaining, like, he strikes out too much. He doesn't walk enough. And with his speed, you want to see him on base a lot. Last year, he improved his strikeout to walk ratio immensely. I mean, he is really working year after year to try and make more contact, get on base more often. The defense has always been there, but and he has that sweet swing. I mean, what you're looking at is he's still a kid. I mean, he's still developing. We saw this year he came into camp. He's bulked up. I mean, he's a lot bigger than he was when he was drafted. He was a lanky high school kid. I mean, you got to give these guys some time, and you can't just look at them and say, oh, you weren't a superstar in your first year. Well, then it's good to write you off. I mean, look at Jalen Ortiz, a guy that signed for $4 million back in 2015, I think, 2014. I don't remember.
Some years ago, yeah.
He was 16 years old, showed this immense raw power, and then just came up the other day and hit a opposite field grand slam. I mean, these guys, they need time to mature and develop, and both Mickey and Jalen are 21 and 22 years old now. I mean, they are still so young, and they're still figuring themselves out, and you just got to give them the time to mature and really make those improvements to their game as they grow.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important, I think, for us to get a look at some of these guys, even if they don't necessarily put up a good showing or their numbers don't really reflect where they are at this point in their pro careers. It's nice to actually get them up and have them face either advanced minor league pitching or in some cases an actual major leaguer and have them gauge where they are, if only for one plate appearance. So you can see what they've been working on, how they've evolved, how they've changed over the last couple of years in some cases. It's nice to see. It's the dichotomy of spring, I guess we can call it, where bad and good performances alike don't really mean a lot. Good ones mean more than bad ones, as far as I'm concerned. I try and look for the good more than the bad. But at the end of spring, and you'll hear this from a lot of players and teams and people around the games, all those stats go out the window. You want to take momentum into the regular season. You want to feel good about yourself. But at the end of the day, if you hit 140, but you hit a few screaming liners over the last couple of weeks of spring that ended up getting caught, well, then you probably feel pretty good about that 140 getting wiped off the plate, right?
Right.
It's not a universal thing, but in a lot of cases, it's always good to try and rack up as many positives as you can and not worry too much about the negatives. And for us as fans, too, to look at these guys and really not take too much stock in it. A couple of other guys that we've noticed stock up. Luke Williams, Nick Maton, and Connor Brogdon. What can you tell us about these three guys and what you've seen out of them so far in spring?
Yeah, Luke Williams, I really love because he played everywhere last year, everywhere except for catcher, but he was a catcher in high school. So, I mean, you've got a guy, he can play every position. I don't necessarily know if he can play them well, but he can play every position. He's seen time already as a youngster at every single one of those spots. And, whether he becomes, a utility outfielder or a utility infielder or what have you, it's valuable to have guys like that. It's valuable to have guys like Nick Maton, who, Nick Maton is your typical really good eventual utility player. Mm-hmm. He has really good plate discipline, really good, I can't say really good hit tool, but really nice fast hands. He makes a lot of contact. I mean, you're looking at two guys who can play all around the diamond who, that's really valuable. And, Nick Maton, consensus top 20 prospect in the system. Luke Williams yet to kind of break into that range, but still very much a prospect. And both of them are having huge springs so far. Huge, absolutely huge. And Connor Brogdon, who is probably my favorite, I know you favor Addison Russ, but my favorite, who doesn't love a splitter? My favorite candidate for, that guy that's really going to maybe break into the bullpen this year. I mean, that dude ascended through the minor leagues last year, absolutely tore it up. And he's got a great fastball, tops out at 97, I think. A really nice arsenal, lots of swing and miss stuff. Struck out a lot of dudes last year, but he also got more innings. But, you're looking at a guy that, and has had a really nice spring as well, I should mention. Mm-hmm. You're looking at a guy that, good velocity, good stuff, needs to hone in the command. He's definitely not a starter anymore. But he's on his way, and that's a common theme throughout the system now. I mean, we've seen a lot of really, really good pitching talent that has taken that next step forward as they transition into the bullpen. I mean, we were just talking about the other day Ramon Rosso,
Yes.
who was brilliant in his. The only reason he's not on our stock up is because he really hasn't had a lot of chance to, pitch just yet. But he was absolutely on fire in his 2 innings the other day. You look at who else? I mean, Mauricio Llovera, who has had absolutely blistering stuff as we've seen or not seen in terms of yesterday because the game wasn't televised again.
Sneaky, sneaky.
But we're seeing guys who, they may not pan out as starters, but you can only have so many starting pitchers in your major league roster. You need those guys that are going to be lights out of the bullpen, and the Phillies have a lot of those.
Yep, and it's a good problem to have, even if you
Yes, it is.
Even if you don't necessarily think everybody in camp is a contender for a major league job right out of the gate. You want them to be eventually, right?
Right.
So it's nice to have them set themselves up that way for the future. All right, so we have to be fair and balanced, at least as much as we can be, and talk a little bit about a couple of guys who haven't quite been up to snuff so far in the spring. And thankfully, this list is short. Most of the offense, really, there isn't a lot to complain about there. A couple of guys, I guess, are a little high in strikeouts, but for the most part, this is a team that is leading the entire league in the spring in average through the first, week and change, and a number of other offensive categories. They're really off to a great start at the plate. Some of the young pitchers that we've been mentioning are also off to awesome starts. Not really a whole lot to complain about. And the three names you see off to the side here, it's not so much complaints as much as it's, okay, you're a week and change into spring here. It's time to start showing that you're rounding into form a little bit, especially because these three guys are pitchers. They've had a little bit more time to get ready. They reported, in most cases, ahead of the position players. And we can start with Edgar Garcia, who is a fringe guy to begin with. I believe in him having another level that he hasn't quite gotten to yet, obviously. But this is a guy with, on a stuff level, really good stuff and a really good breaking ball. If he can just harness it and stop missing the zone, I can just feel the frustration bubbling up. But he hasn't done that in his first couple of appearances, and it doesn't really look like he's all that different from last year, at least not yet. Again, we can't qualify this enough. It's early, and things can change. But so far, he looks like the same guy, and that's not quite good enough to be a major league mainstay. What do you think about Edgar Garcia so far?
Yeah, I love his slider. I'm obsessed with it. It's fantastic. But the issue here is that a lot of his fastballs and his, the stuff that he should be locating, it's sitting really flat. Or at least it was in that one spot of him we saw on TV. Yesterday, he was brilliant. He threw an inning and struck out 2 and, apparently was better. But what I saw on TV that first time around was not exactly, what you'd like to see out of a guy who pitched in the majors last year. And that is something that we should talk about because he was rushed. He, went from Double-A straight forward. I mean, we weren't supposed to be calling him up last year. Same with J.D. Hammer, who's also on this list. We weren't supposed to have to call these guys up because they were still in mid-development. And unluckily, with the, 9 or 10 injured bullpen arms we suffered for last year, we had to make some drastic moves and we had to bring some guys up that weren't quite ready. And, it definitely stinks because it probably put a bit of a bump in their development, but also we were hoping that they would kind of be more ready than we've seen them be, and that's just not the case. And, that's something we'll have to deal with. But hopefully with Edgar, the fastball location gets better and the slider just keeps falling out of the zone because that's what you want. You want to generate those swings and misses.
Exactly right. And you talk about bumps in development. We saw that last year toward the end of the year with J.D. Hammer, who was optioned down in the middle of the summer and by his own admission tried too hard to get back to the major leagues. He took himself out of his normal headspace, to paraphrase, and he got hit around. He got beat up, and he hasn't really come out of the gate strong so far this spring either. This is a nice arm to have as depth, but if you want this guy to be part of your rotation of rotation of relievers, your cavalry that comes in and out as people need to be shuffled around, as injuries happen, as performance wanes, and you need to sort of freshen things up back there, You need him to inspire a little bit more confidence, and it's not quite there yet. What's he been missing so far in the spring that you've seen?
It it sounds to me like, again, he's overthinking it. I think, this is a kid that has, a really good fastball, like solid 95, 96 averages, uh, really good slider. Again, excuse the pun, falls off like a hammer.
Yeah.
But he's overthinking it. He's not, he used to have a really good game plan. He used to, I believe, I saw him a couple times in Reading. I think I saw him. I can't remember, but he used to have a really good game plan. If he would elevate stuff, he would keep his fastballs up. He would, sometimes spot guys inside, outside, what have you, and then he'd, again, excuse the pun, drop the hammer, and he'd get them swinging.
That's two, Alex. That's two.
I know.
I'm keeping track.
Strike two. He had this game plan that was working for him, and that was really, he used to detail that too, and maybe, I don't know, maybe guys figured him out. Maybe I don't know. I just know that when he was sent down, he fell apart, and he's continuing to fall apart as he goes along in spring, and it's a real shame. But I think with, again, Brian Price, huge, and just the biggest impact for the Phillies this year, is working. He's emphasizing simplifying things, and hopefully, upon doing so, JD Hammer will be able to kind of get back to what he used to do, which was, stick to this game plan that was working for him, and that was really, that was the reason he was called up. He was called up because he had this game plan that was working, and he was nailing guys in the minors. So that's why he was the go-to guy. So hopefully he can just simplify and get back to where he used to be.
It would be good if he could soak up some tutelage, make sure
Seriously.
he maximizes the time he gets with Price before he gets sent down. Because right now, it looks like he's probably going to start the year in Lehigh again. And hopefully he doesn't force it. And hopefully he realizes he needs to be patient, get back to the way he was, something that put him on the team's major league radar to begin with. And maybe we'll see him again later in the season.
And everyone wants to see him in the majors.
Sure.
Everyone wants those bulky glasses and that long flowing hair. And we all want that, but he's got to put up the numbers first. He really has to reprove himself, as it were.
Absolutely agreed. And speaking of major league relievers, or former major league relievers, Anthony Swarzak, who was a late addition to camp, also has not really performed well. Now, again, he's one of those guys who's only had one appearance. But we're talking about a spot that has a lot of competition at the back end of this bullpen, and there are a lot of guys vying for that spot. Now, with the uncertainty about some guys' roles, are they going to be a starter down in Lehigh and stay stretched out? Or are they going to be converted back to a reliever? Ranger Suarez comes to mind. There are more guys than normal who are vying for this spot. Having the 26-man helps, but it looks like that's probably going to be used on a position player, maybe 13 position players, 13 pitchers, as we break camp, especially with the Kutch injury, just to preserve some outfield depth. If you're a guy like Swarzak, you have a major league track record, but your peak days are getting a little more distant in the rearview mirror, and becomes more and more important with every outing you get in Major League camp to prove you belong there and prove that you should get that job and make the team out of camp. How far behind is he? I know it's only one appearance, so again, we're going to put an asterisk out there. It's only one appearance, but it wasn't a great one. Has he lost a full step, or is he still firmly in the mix with guys like Francisco Liriano and the others?
It works very much against him because he had such a horrible second half. I don't remember if he was injured at all, but I do remember, he started off really well with the Mariners, and then went to the Braves and kept moving along, and then he just stunk up the joint. I mean, he was horrible. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but he was really bad. And coming into spring and showing once again that you're not performing well is not a good thing. And it definitely hurts you when you've had, when you left the season on a bad note. So we'll see. Again, like you said, only one appearance, but we've seen guys like Francisco Liriano come out of the gate super strong. I mean, he had a 6-pitch first debut inning, and yesterday I think he pitched as well. I think so. And scoreless. He walked the guy, I think, but scoreless inning is a scoreless inning. And then we're seeing other really strong rotation candidates come out of the gate. Who has been really good? Reggie McClain. Reggie McClain was really impressive, and he's on the 40-man roster. So
yes,
maybe
he is.
Maybe you'd pick him over. Yes, as has been so heavily emphasized to us. He is on the 40-man roster, but he also was able to pitch 2 innings. I mean,
Right.
that's huge. That's huge. And I tweeted this, but he has a really Jake Arrieta-like sinker, but is pitching at 2015 Jake Arrieta velocity, which we all know
Something to watch.
what was going on with Jake Arrieta in 2015. I'm not saying his command is nearly as good, and I'm not saying he is a 2015 Jake Arrieta, but he's a guy that can go multiple innings, induces a lot of soft contact, and you really need those guys. So there are guys that are definitely getting ahead of him, and that is not good news for Anthony Swarzak. The good news is that his main competition is Bud Norris, Francisco Liriano, and himself. So.
Right.
They're going to have to pick at least one of those guys probably going into the season, as D-Rob is hurt. Sir Anthony might not be ready. Victor Arano might not be ready. We still don't know. But, it's likely that his spring numbers are going to be more important than most. So he's got to start putting it together sooner rather than later.
Still certainly a lot to be decided. So that was a quick look at who through the first week or so of spring training has really been making a good impression on us. Thankfully, again, the ratio is far more in favor of the positives than the negatives. That is always something you want to take, no matter how early or late into spring training it is. But unfortunately, it's not all good news. And as much as I wish it was, we do have some bad news. It's not totally unexpected bad news, but we learned yesterday that Andrew McCutchen, the team's starting left fielder, of course, will not be ready for opening day as he continues to rehab from his torn ACL suffered last June. Now, there's a footnote that comes in and says the team hopes he's ready to begin sometime in April, as you're looking at a screen cap of Matt Gelb from the Athletics tweet from yesterday. There's been no setback. His knee is apparently still feeling fine. They just need to actually get him into more game-like situations, I guess, to test it out, to make sure he can round corners, to make sure the leg is fully free and clear of danger. It's a tough thing to come back from such a major leg injury, so it's not really surprising that he won't be ready to come back to game action some 10 months out from the injury. But now, things get a little interesting with the rest of the roster because you have a left field spot to fill and you have a leadoff position to solve. Now, it may only be for 10 days. Maybe he's only on the IL for the minimum stay. But those are still 10 days and a handful of games where the team is going to have a left field plan, and they're going to have a leadoff plan. So, that being said, what do you think those plans are? We'll start with the first one. Who do you think gets the start in left field on opening day?
I think it very much depends on who they're facing, which is likely going to be Sandy Alcantara, I would believe. So if it's a righty like Sandy, I would assume Jay Bruce is going to get the start. But they're probably going to run into a left-hander sooner rather than later. So I would say, Kyle Garlick, who is now on the 40-man roster, it would have been Nick Martini, but he saw a DFA and then cleared waivers, so he's not on the 40-man just yet. But Kyle Garlick, who has had a really good spring thus far and has shown he has a really big arm. He put a guy out at the plate. I can't remember what day that was, but he was excellent. And he's showing some power. He's probably their go-to backup, as it were. That's not Jay Bruce. So likely you'll see Jay Bruce get the start, and then maybe Kyle Garlick comes in later in the game just as a defensive replacement. Or maybe Kyle Garlick gets a start, and Jay Bruce comes in later to face a right-hand heavy bullpen or what have you. But I think it's mostly going to be those two platooning for the time being until Kutch is ready. Mm-hmm. So
that makes some sense.
But then there's the other issue.
Sure. And I think as far as you can call it this, it's good news for the likes of Adam Hazley and Roman Quinn. Yes. Nothing was assured, and their names weren't necessarily written onto the roster in ink for opening day. The chances were high. But now, with one fewer outfielder in the mix to start the year, you can almost guarantee that both of them are going to be on the roster. Right. Whether one is the eventual opening day starter, I think, like you said, depends a bit on the matchup. Also depends on who's playing well. If Roman is still healthy, of course, which we have to say, it's good news for them. But it's better news, like you were saying, for guys like Kyle Garlick, especially if Jay Bruce's arm injury isn't fully healed by the time opening day rolls around. Maybe he starts the year on the IL too. You can't rule that out.
Yeah, that's true.
It's a really again, calling it good news seems a little bit cheeky, but for guys who are trying to claw their way onto this roster, especially as an outfielder where the team has so many options, Nick Williams, who I continue to forget and is kind of like an afterthought still for some reason. It's also good news for him. Yeah, he's there, and potentially he could be in, especially if Bruce goes down and they do lose one left-handed bat. There are a number of things still in play. We're a long way away, and Kutch being out for opening day is the only thing we know right now. Maybe Bruce gets healthy and it becomes a bit of a moot point, but it's certainly something that those players are keeping an eye on. We're taking a look at it as well. But the second part of the Kutch injury equation is, of course, who hits leadoff. There are a couple of guys who kind of fit the mold of a leadoff hitter, maybe not as well as Kutch did last year, where he walked as many times as he struck out while still showing a bit of power, showing incredible discipline. You could put a guy like Segura up there who's more contact-oriented, but not necessarily very walk-oriented. There's some thought that maybe Harper goes back up there again. He excelled in the leadoff role last year, but you probably don't want to put him there for too long. You want him driving guys in. There's also a thought that maybe Roman Quinn could lead off if he starts. Maybe Hazley if he keeps making good contact. Maybe Gregorius, although he's a little bit of a free swinger. There's no real clear front runner for Plan B. Do you, though, have a favorite for who you'd like to see lead off until Kutch gets back from his injury?
I definitely don't have any strong opinions. My brain goes first to Roman Quinn or Gene Segura, once again, depending on the matchup. But I think Gene especially, even though he wasn't great out of the leadoff role, what we've seen from him this spring is lots of contact, lots of really, really good, just hitting the gaps contact. And he's got the speed. He definitely has the speed to beat out some infield singles and, maybe even steal a base or two along the way. And he's, as has been so emphasized throughout the year, he's slimmed down. So, maybe that's just a really good mold for a leadoff guy in Kutch's stead. There is, however, the option and this isn't exactly a leadoff hitter, but there is the option. Yasiel Puig is still a free agent, and depending on, I know this is weird, but depending on what the market for him looks like, and depending on, all that stuff, it does kind of pose a really interesting thought. Puig has a big arm. He's typically a right fielder, but there's no sense in saying that he can't play left. He's a good defender. He's still a free agent, and I don't know what his market looks like, but I know he wants to play. I know he wants to get out there. I know he wants to, not sit around on his butt during spring training and, as the season gets later. And it doesn't feel like a great fit because I'm sure he wouldn't love to ride the bench. But depending on how serious this whole Kutch thing is, if you can get Yasiel Puig on a steal, there's no sense in not going after that. And there's no sense in saying that maybe he couldn't be traded after Kutch comes back. Maybe you could be, use it as a jumping off point, show that you still have, you're better than what you put up last year, and really show all these other teams, put on a showcase in Philadelphia, and then go somewhere else afterwards.
I like the thought because I like Puig the player. He's not the guy who burst onto the scene in his rookie year and hasn't quite been that same player, but that doesn't really matter if we're looking at a short-term replacement. I think the fact that, now I'm getting to thinking about payroll things, the fact that the Phillies saved about $2 million in the Real Muto arbitration
situation.
They're
at about 5.7 before tax.
Yeah, so if we're thinking about that, there's probably some juggling that the team could do to get a guy like that underneath that figure if they're still intent on staying below until the trade deadline or whatever their plan is. I really wouldn't worry too much about the financial aspect of it. I think it's an interesting approach, especially because you look at a guy like Kyle Garlick, who I know we both like, and we think there are interesting things going on with that bat. Late 20s, some 28. One of the few right-handed options that this team is currently carrying on its bench.
Right.
Yeah, maybe if you can convince someone like Puig to come into camp on a contingency deal. I don't think he agrees to a minor league deal, but I'll leave that up to the people who actually sit at the negotiating table. If you can convince a guy like Puig to come in and provide a little competition, well, this team could use a little bit of right-handed balance, I think. They could use an option that swings hard from the right side who could potentially drive in a few more runs. I think things get a little tricky when you start looking ahead to Kutch's return, especially because we don't know how serious it is, and hopefully he's back within the first 2 weeks, but we don't really know, and hopefully he doesn't suffer a setback, of course. But it's hard to tell how long a guy like Puig would be around, and then things get a little strange. You know, how do you handle that? Does he accept any kind of assignment? He probably doesn't, but then he forfeits money, blah, 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 blah. That's for another time. I think it's creative, and I think it's interesting because it's a void that needs to be filled. Maybe he's not really a prototypical leadoff hitter, but maybe that doesn't really matter. And maybe you see what you got for the first couple of weeks, and things could be interesting. I don't know.
What I meant by that,
creative.
why I brought it up here is because whoever your leadoff hitter is going to be, they get displaced from the lineup. So if you're not choosing Gene Segura, who would probably be batting second, you're choosing Bryce Harper, and then you need somebody to, you know, fill in for driving runs in. You need, you know, and Jay Bruce is good at that. But like you said, if Jay Bruce isn't ready to go, what do we do? I mean, Kyle Garlick is great and all, but there's no guarantee there. He's never had, you know, he's had maybe, what was it, like 30 at-bats in the majors? And he was good. He was really good. But there's no guarantee. And what, if I've learned over the years, what Philly fans hate more than anything is the inconsistency that is brought up by, you know, these new guys, quote unquote. Like when Scott Kingery got up to a really slow start, there was a lot of people that weren't very kind to him and that thought he was finished after his first year. And obviously that's not the case. But, you know, you want to see guys like Kyle Garlick succeed.
Sure.
But will they?
But will they? That's an excellent question.
Exactly. So we'll see. Like you said, it's creative.
It is. It is most certainly creative. Can't dock any points there. But the Kyle Garlick point is interesting because it helps us segue into our next segment. Garlick, as you mentioned, has not spent a lot of time in the major leagues, so you don't really know what his next season might look like. Maybe 2020 is a breakout for him. Maybe he becomes somebody who plays a pivotal role on a team with championship aspirations. Sound like a couple of guys from Phillies history that any of us would know? So what we wanted to think about in honor of League Day, it being
segue, Paul.
Yeah, you know, I practice these things in the mirror, and sometimes they come out sounding okay. What we wanted to do in honor of this League Day, February 29th in the year 2020, is to ask you all, and we had some help from folks out on Twitter and social media and our own brains, of course, about who you'd consider was one of your favorite players or most memorable players or someone who sticks out in your mind as making the leap. This is somebody who raised their prospect status or who had a great rookie season or who was an unassuming pickup in free agency and ended up turning things around and being really productive. It could be any number of things. It was a really kind of loose term that anybody could do with whatever they wanted. And so we got a couple of names, and some of them are really, really very interesting. Let me pull up the first one here, and there's a little guy by the name of Pete Incaviglia, who arrived from the Houston Astros prior to the 1993 season, who hadn't really done a whole lot, was kind of an unassuming pickup. His numbers had trended down for the couple of years before the Phillies picked him up. And all he did was come in an OPS around 850, smack 24 homers, almost 100 RBIs, and in 2/3 of a season. He did not play the full season. This was a guy who put up some big numbers in a relatively short amount of time. Incaviglia, I don't know if you all remember, used to have this fantastic mane like a lot of the late 80s and early 90s Phillies were sort of famous for with their mullets, with, you know, Dalton and Dykstra and the likes of those guys.
Dutch's mullet. Yes.
It was a pretty spectacular time for hair. And Pete Incaviglia is certainly a guy, Alex, I think, who qualifies as someone who took a leap and really became kind of a cult hero in Phillies history.
Yeah, I mean, you get a guy that, like you said, didn't play the whole season. He had somewhere in the high 300s of plate appearances, I think. But, you know, you get a guy that comes out of nowhere and knocks you, you know, a good 20-plus home runs. You're going to get a following for that person. I mean, in recent memory, I don't remember really seeing anyone other than Corey Dickerson, who everybody loved last year because he just came in and started mashing mid-season. And, you know, health is always a big concern with him. But you get a guy that comes in and creates such a big impact where you did not expect there to be any. I mean, you're always you're gonna love that, and especially when they've been a veteran. Incaviglia, how long was he playing before uh,
About four or
he
five
came to
years.
the Phillies? 4 or 5 years. Yeah, you get a guy that has a track record of not exactly producing at the highest level, and then he all of a sudden produces at a higher level. You know, the people love that. It makes for good TV. So I mean, yeah, Incaviglia definitely sticks out as one for me that made the quote unquote leap.
Yeah, and moving things back into a little bit more of a recent era, we have one of my personal favorites from the early 2010s Phillies, and that's Antonio Bastardo.
Oh,
He had been in the majors for a couple of years by the time 2012 rolled around, but I don't know what exactly happened in 2012. This guy went on what what my good friend Mike Bauman from The Ringer and I would often call the Antonio Bastardo strikeout rampage. This was a guy who came in, and as you see on the screen there, struck out more than 36% of the guys he faced, which is outlandish. And this was before strikeouts really took off. So this was a number that really stood out. Now, it wasn't his best year overall. He still had an ERA above 4. But as you can see, the rest of his career, his strikeout rate dipped to around 26. That is a huge, huge drop. And eventually he was traded away. He was sent out to the Pirates for another fellow lefty reliever named Joely Rodriguez a couple of years later. But 2012 always stands out to me for just how ridiculous he was, especially with that fastball slider combination, at just striking everybody out.
he was always one that stood out to me. I remember because I was a little younger in 2012. I remember always thinking his name was funny because it sounded like a bad word. But I always remember watching him and seeing that funky arm slot, and I don't know when he started because he had a PED suspension, right? Somewhere around.
Yeah, I can't remember
I
exactly
think
what year, but
with
he
the
got
Pirates though. I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he. So you got to wonder if that's something to do with his strikeout rampage. But I mean, I remember watching him pitch from that funky arm slot from the left side,
Mm-hmm.
and I'd never seen anything like it. And I was automatically obsessed with him, mostly because of the name, but also because I just loved watching him pitch. And I remember in 2012, like I was floored by it because I wasn't too into metrics or anything like that. But every time he stepped to the mound, you know, people would always talk about, this strikeout ratio is unreal, and it just really makes you wonder how, a guy with there's a lot of fastball slider combos out there that are really, really good. But a guy with a pretty simple fastball slider combo and a really funky arm slot comes together in this one big mesh and mold of a 36% strikeout,
Ludicrous.
strikeout ratio over an entire year. That's absurd.
Yeah.
That is like nobody does that. Even
was...
and Adam Dunn existed in the 2010s, but
Mm-hmm.
that was the only guy that you were really looking at, and you were like, nice 200 Ks on the year. But that was it. I mean, it's unreal. That's part of why I just think he's one of the funniest pitchers in Phillies history, because he is just such a weird case, and he came out of nowhere.
And along those same lines, coming out of nowhere, there was another fellow by the name of Kenny Giles, who arrived on the scene in 2014 as a rookie after undergoing really one of the most massive leaps as a prospect in recent Phillies history. This is a guy who was in high A the previous season. He was bad. He had an ERA over 6. He had a couple of strikeouts. He looked okay, but the walks were really high. He was giving up homers. And then he arrives on the scene in spring of 2014 with what a lot of evaluators would say was a fastball and breaking ball that were easily 1 to 2 grades above where they were previously. This was a guy who was now touching 100 with relative ease. The slider was absolutely wipeout. And all he does in 2014 is come up and strike out almost 40% of the guys he faced, have an absolutely minuscule ERA. I think he only allowed 1 home run, and that might have been in his very first appearance. And
oh my gosh, really?
It's something insane like that.
Wow.
And as you can see, that stands in stark contrast to his 2013 when he was in the minor leagues and pitched to a 6.3 ERA in just 25 innings, so his season was abbreviated. But this is a guy who absolutely burst on the scene, and for only 2 years, it was a brief tenure, looked like one of the best relievers or one of the best pitchers overall that the Phillies had ever produced.
And then he followed it up. That's the big thing for me, because I always that was when I really started paying attention to like everything baseball, was around like the 2014, 2015 era.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember looking at him and just thinking he was such an anomaly. Like, this dude comes out of nowhere, has a great rookie season, if you can call it that, and then follows it up. Like, he put on a show in 2015. Again, don't have the stats in front of me, but you see a guy pumping 100 that has a second good year, like back-to-back years of around 1.5 ERA. Can't remember. But like, this dude was striking out everyone. He was not allowing runs. He was saving games. He was, he was everything you wanted. And that's why, the Astros came through and put together a trade package that was at the time considered very good. But I'll take anything you can get from a guy that comes out of nowhere, like anytime, any day of the week. And Vince Velasquez is still pitching.
Yes, he is.
In the major leagues. You can't say that about Mark Appel.
Well.
And I hope he's doing well. Hope the law career is going great. He won at the law, right? I think. And then who else did they get? That
Brett Oberholzer.
Brett Oberholzer. That's there you go. And then
there was also the exchange of the Arauzas, the unrelated Arauzas, Harold and Jonathan.
Yeah.
But I can never,
Jonathan.
For the life of me, cannot
Which
keep
one
them
went
straight.
where?
I can't remember who went where.
I think we had Harold. I'm almost positive we had Harold. Can't remember. But you get a really good return for a guy that seemingly came out of nowhere, and you can't help but be somewhat happy with it, I guess. Maybe they should have held on to him. You can argue that, but at the time, that 3-year window of just how bad he was to how good he was to being like one of the biggest trades of the mid-season 2015 time. It's crazy. He really, I forgot about how much of nowhere he spawned from.
It was pretty remarkable.
Crazy.
In a less dramatic transformation, we do have a fan favorite that we can get to talking about, and that would be one Mr. Chooch, Carlos Ruiz, who in 2009 burst onto the scene following up the championship run with a really nice season. You can see it's a high 700s OPS, and this was a guy who, in the previous 3 years, was really not quite that kind of hitter at all. You can see he batted in the low 240s. His on base was decent in spite of that, in the high 320s, but he wasn't hitting for power. There wasn't really a lot he was offering at the plate. Of course, he was very good defensively and stayed that way through his entire Phillies career. But in terms of offense, he looked like he was always going to be a glove-first kind of guy, destined to bat eighth in the order forever and ever, amen. And then 2009 happened, and there was a great awakening, and Chooch became not just one of the better defensive catchers going in the game, but he turned into one of the very best offensive catchers from that year on through 2012, his first All-Star appearance. You can see he kept that momentum going. You can call 2009 the start of it, and that was the start of the breakout, where he hit in the 250s, had a really nice differential between the average and on base to on base over 350, and got that slugging above 420, which is awesome. And then he hits over 300 for the next 3 years, including that monster 2012 year where he OPS is over 900.
He was an all-star that year, right?
He was a magnificent player. There was really no shortchanging it, because he turned into a guy who was just not reminiscent of the prospect when he was originally coming up through the system. And that's, he would have been a fan favorite anyway, because he was part of the 08 team. You always remember that. You remember him catching the slider to Eric Hinsky and running out to the mound and embracing Brad Litch. And he did not have a good offensive year that year. We now forget about that because 09 came around and the years after that, and he blossomed, and it was wonderful. So that is, for obvious reasons, one of the favorite breakouts around these parts. What do you remember about Chooch and 09, the early 2010s?
The obvious moment that sticks out for me is the Halladay no-hitter. I mean, he was already a favorite of mine, but Roy Halladay, for those who don't know, is just my favorite baseball player of all time. He turned into a guy that, I would look at, like you said, perpetually batting eighth, and, I'd be like, oh, this is an automatic out. Like, it's over. Like, whatever. Like, they'd be down and their last at-bat is to Chooch. But then the amazing 2009 began. And I remember, it was 3 consecutive seasons, right, that he hit above 300. Just
Yeah,
it
he
was
for the stretch he was over 300 from 2010 to 12. Yeah.
okay. I remember because then he started bumping up in the order, and I was just like, Chooch is
Hmm.
hitting, sixth today. That's
Yeah.
new, and like you see this guy who has made so many memorable plays. There's that last out of the Halladay no hitter. There's the um, what else is there? I mean, some incredible the Utley play. I mean, you see some of these amazing like just plays that centralize around Chooch, and you're just like, oh well, yeah, he's a great glove, and I mean, I wouldn't rather have anybody else. And then out of nowhere, he becomes this big bat, and it kind of reminds me of prime Yadier Molina,
Mm.
where Yadi was always projected to have a better bat than Carlos Ruiz was, but you know Yadi was the best catcher in baseball for a long, long time.
Long time.
And he's still probably one of the premier
Hmm.
defensive catchers in baseball to this day. But the bat was even better than people expected. Yachty was hitting 300 year after year after year. He was slugging home runs. Even now, he still hits a good amount of home runs. I mean, he's he's old. He's up there in age, and Chooch was getting there too. And
Right.
all of a sudden, out of nowhere, these guys just start hitting, and I love Chooch forever and ever just because of everything that he's done for the team. But even more so because he wasn't just a good glove for his entire career. He was more than that, and that's more than you could ask for.
Absolutely correct. And another one of his teammates from that time is another guy that we can talk about, Mr. Jason Werth, who in 2007,
Yes.
after missing all of the '06 season, in 2007 had a partial season where he looked spectacular. And you
Yep.
had to wonder, well, okay, maybe this is the first round talent that the Orioles thought they had all those years ago before injuries started to derail his career. He comes out, he hits almost 300. Again, look at that split. I mean, this was a guy who really had about as much plate discipline, I would say, as Pat Burrell, whose calling card was almost entirely plate discipline related.
Yes.
The thing that Worth did differently is that he had better contact, of course, but he had gap to gap ability and was more athletic in the field. He was a more complete player when he was really fully going. That's not to slight Burrell, of course, who I love, and I love the way he approached his at-bats at the plate. But Jason Worth was a guy who really was on the verge of being washed up despite this talent,
Right.
despite being a first-round pick. He was in the early 20s. I think it was 22nd overall. And injuries were just going to take him out of the game. You hear every so often about these guys who either never make it to the major leagues as a high pick because of injuries or just sort of flame out, never fully regain their stuff. Happens all the time, sadly. And that was going to happen to Worth. But then Pat Gillick snatches him up. 2007 happens, and the rest is basically history. You can see from 2002 to '05, this was a guy who didn't really hit for a lot of power, didn't hit for a lot of contact, still had a decent amount of plate discipline, but really wasn't doing much of anything. The Phillies took a flyer on him, and what do you know? Here they are, a championship later, with that guy being a huge, huge part of it, and a big reason to thank him.
Seriously. And the more impressive part of that for me is that he learned to carry that over into his, like, as he was getting older. I mean, he still saw his fair share of injuries as his career transpired, but I mean, even when he was with the Nationals for the latter part of his career, he was he was stellar. He was always a threatening bat. And you look in that, the lineups where it's him, it's Bryce Harper, Ryan Zimmerman in his prime. I mean, that Nationals team was really good, and Jason Worth was a big part of that. Um, and he was never just a guy after 2000, especially after 2008, but after he follows all of this up with like really good years, he was never a guy that you could look at again and say, oh yeah, no, that's just Jason Worth. Like at one point he was a flying candidate, like he was a guy that you'd take on a flyer, and the next you know 7-8 years he's an all-star. He's brilliant, and you saw that with the contract that he got from the Nationals. He got a big payday, and a lot of Phillies fans were mad at the time. But
He brought
you get
legitimacy.
offered that kind of money as a guy who was almost out of
Yeah.
baseball.
You take it.
Come on.
You take
Like-
it. And he brought legitimacy to an entire franchise. He was not
Seriously.
still on that team when they won the World Series last year, but in some ways, the ripple effect of him signing helped lead to that moment. Maybe it's a small ripple, but he absolutely lended credibility to that franchise. And you know, the more time goes by, I hope more people in Philadelphia realize just how important he was, even if he could be a little bit cantankerous,
I love him.
a little bit gruff. That's okay. Yeah, it brings a little bit of edge to things. We had a couple other names that were submitted in that really left a mark in varying ways. You have Curt Schilling, of course, who was brought over after also spending time with Baltimore and Houston, and then breaking out in 1992 as a starter. He had been a reliever before coming over to the Phillies, and the Phillies helped turn him into a borderline Hall of Famer. You have John Denny, who in 1983 won a Cy Young Award
John Denny.
after nothing. Where did he come from? You have Peter Bourjos, who in the dark ages of 2016, I know a lot of folks have tuned out by this point, and you absolutely cannot be blamed for tuning out. But in the summer of 2016, June, July, Peter Bourjos was the hottest hitter on the planet. He hit something like 600 over the span of a month. Not literally, but it was basically that hot. He hit home runs. He was stealing bases. He was playing the field. He looked unbelievable. I mean, this was a guy who years before had been linked in Roy Halladay trade rumors when the Angels were involved back in 09-10. He was still a prospect at that point. Hadn't really panned out apart from the defense. And then he comes around and swings a huge... Defense was fantastic. He was always an awesome defensive player. But then the stick comes around in the summer of 2016. You're like, who is this?
Where's that guy been?
Where did he come from? And then, of course, we have to include him in any conversation like this. It's Dominic Brown. No. Hey, look, he made an all-star team. The rest of his career may not have panned out the way a lot of us would have hoped. He was not the Jason Werth successor that we hoped, and he didn't have a really long, fortuitous major league career. But you know what? He made an all-star team. He's an all-star.
And lest we forget, the man was ranked above Mike Trout. I think it was 2012, 2013. Can't remember. Ranked above Mike Trout across the board. I mean, at a time you would be saying that Dominic Brown had the potential to be one of the best players in baseball. I mean,
I don't like hearing that for a couple of reasons. One, of course, is that, okay, yeah, Mike Trout is going to end up being the best player in baseball history, and Dom Brown was not that. But it also reminds me of a time, and this is confession time, so I'll bare my soul a little bit to all of you. Around that time, I was fortunate enough to write a quick little blurb for ESPN's Sweet Spot. That was being curated by David Schoenfield. And one of the questions in a roundtable that a couple of us were asked, and I can't remember who my counterparts were, I'm sorry, where if you could pick one for this season and one for the future out of Bryce Harper, Mike Trout, and Jesus Montero, who would you pick? Guess who I picked for that season?
You can't be serious.
I went with Jesus Montero. So, and for the long term, I picked Harper. So I was wrong twice, really, if you think about it. But that's how these things go. Sometimes you can see a prospect. I'm going to use this platform to defend myself. Sometimes you can see a prospect and think, yes, this guy's going to be a star. I believe in them. And then it doesn't pan out that way. That is an instance of being very wrong. Sometimes you can be only a little wrong and save some face. But that's just how this thing works. People thought Dom Brown had a chance of being a better player than Mike Trout. Okay, it happens. I can relate because I thought Jesus Montero for a season was going to be a better player than Mike Trout too. What are you going to do? What are you going to do?
Paul, I've never heard that story before.
I don't tell many people for obvious reasons.
Just want you to know that is such a shame.
I know.
You had the choice between a now likely to be Phillies franchise icon, the best player baseball's ever seen, and Jesus Montero. You had a 2 out of 3 chance of being somewhat right.
Yes, I did. And what do you think I did with it? I'm sorry for you. That's okay.
I pity you.
it helped me grow. And
That's true. That's true.
Now you can
look
all
at us now.
Google it and find it in ESPN's archives and take screencaps and laugh at me.
That's what I'm doing after this.
Oh my God. Okay. Well, that fortunately brings us to the end of this program today. It was a wonderful time getting to reminisce about some of the famous leaps in recent and not so recent Phillies history, catching up with some of the guys who have made a good early first impression in camp, and of course thinking about what life is going to look like for the first couple of the weeks of the season without Andrew McCutchen. A lot of time to go left in spring. A lot of ground to make up for guys who have fallen behind, and a lot left to prove for some of the folks who have gotten off to good starts. The next televised game is still about a week away, unfortunately, but a number of games are on the radio, so we'll have to just listen to the sweet sounds of the bat cracks and the mitts popping until we're back on the air and we have actual video to look at. But until that point, Alex, do you have any parting thoughts about what's to come in camp for the next week or so before we hit the airwaves again?
I'm still going to tell everyone to keep their eyes on Derek Hall. He's getting a lot of playing time. Hasn't exactly hit the screamers that I've been predicting, but I still think, just watch, he will entertain you this spring. But also, keep watching the kids. I mean, these prospects are putting up really, really great numbers, putting on shows, and they're doing it against legit major league pitching in some cases. And I mean, if the spring continues on the way it has been, we're in for one heck of a ride before the season actually starts. So keep muddling through until we get more televised games, because apparently that's a thing that we have to do.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Alex, thank you so much. Everyone out there, thank you so much for joining us this week. We continue to have fun doing these things, and we hope you're having fun too. Obviously, and we're going to plug this again, if you enjoy what we're doing, go ahead and add a subscribe and throw a thumbs up on there. It helps make us feel good and know what we're doing is right and helping you guys out. If you have any suggestions for the program, you can email us at thegoodfighttv@gmail.com. Otherwise, we'll see you around Twitter. We'll see you around thegoodfight.com. Go Phils, and enjoy the rest of your Leap Day. Thanks, everybody.